Now, Mr. Douglas met Mr. Lincoln face to face on 3 occasions. The first time was August 10th, 1863. Now, Mr. Douglas had been recruiting troops for the Union Army, African American troops for the Union Army for the Civil War. He was very instrumental in recruiting troops for both the 54th and 55th Massachusetts. Amongst the first 23 individuals he recruited, 2 of them were his sons, Lewis and Charles Douglas. His other son, Fred Jr., was down in the Mississippi region recruiting for black troops as well. And then Mr. Douglas started recruiting for troops in Pennsylvania, but he began to get discouraged. And it was a number of reasons. You know, he felt like troops were being stationed to protect owners, their property, and to help keep the enslaved in line. He said that they were spending more time kicking black folks out of the Union lines than they were shooting rebels. He pointed out that Lincoln had made the statement that black men were the cause of the war. But his biggest indictment was this. He says that the Union Army was not really taking this thing seriously. He said that they were fighting this this war with their soft white hand by keeping their black iron hand chained and helpless behind them. And he said that this war was not going to prosper until it took on an anti-slavery attitude and until they started to recruit blacks to be enlisted on the loyal side. Now, Mr. Douglas understood the argument against letting black folk fight. And everybody realizes that your argument actually becomes stronger when you present the opposing argument. And so he says, yeah, he understood that people thought that blacks couldn't think, they couldn't be trusted, they were childlike, they were lazy and shiftless, and, you know, one crack of the master's whip, and they'd be ready to throw their guns down and go running back to the plantation. And it was never favorable amongst some whites to put guns in the hands of blacks. Well, I can understand that, especially blacks who had not been treated too well by whites. I understand that. And this went all the way back to the Revolutionary War, this reluctance to let black folk fight. And when the framers wrote the Second Amendment, your right to bear arms, in most instances, it did not apply to black people. And this would be the exact same accusations that would be cited in the 1925 Army report on the use of Negro manpower during wartime. They would say that blacks were leaderless, they weren't patriotic, smaller brains, afraid of the dark, superstitious, all sorts of stuff. And after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, the New York draft riots, which took place in 1863, revealed how some folk really felt. And you have people who wrote in primary sources said, look, I will fight for the Union, but I'll be darned if I'm going to fight for Negroes. And of course, I am keeping that G-rated. So Mr. Douglas called on the president. He went to the White House and he had 3 points that he wanted to discuss. Now, I must admit that Mr. Douglas was nervous about meeting the president. And he talked about that, he talked about in his book. He says, you know, he walked in, he saw the president seated, president got up to greet him, and he starts to, I'm Mr. Douglas, Mr. President, it's nice to meet you. Now I am here. He says the president abruptly but politely said, Mr. Douglas, I already know who you are. I know why you're here. Come right in, sit down. I'm glad to meet you. I would have loved to have seen that. Now, Mr. Douglas had 3 reasons or 3 points that he wanted to bring up to the president. He wanted to talk about equal pay for black soldiers. He wanted to talk about fair treatment for black POWs by the hands of their Confederate captors. And he also, 3rd point, says, look, if black soldiers perform on the field, they should be rewarded and promoted on the same basis as white soldiers. Now, hold on, Mr. Douglas. You can't go and talk to the president like that with all these demands. No, let me tell you, at that point in his life, Mr. Douglas is 45 years old and he is way beyond sugarcoating anything. Now, here are Mr. Lincoln's responses to Mr. Douglas's points as it pertained to equal pay. He says, you know, it was difficult enough to get people to go along with letting black folks fight in the army in the first place. And the wisdom, at least in their mind, the wisdom of that was still in doubt. It's almost like they should be doggone glad that we even let them in the army, in the whatever capacity we put them. They should just be glad to be able to fight for the ideals of freedom and liberty. And he said that, paying black soldiers the same amount for white soldiers to do the exact same job could be offensive to somebody. Yeah, let me say that again. To pay black soldiers the exact same thing that you're paying white soldiers to do the exact same job could be offensive to somebody. On the point of fair treatment, now remember Jefferson Davis had put out his declaration, and it was in response to what Benjamin Butler was doing down in the South. He says, look, if Benjamin Butler's caught any of his senior officers who were caught commanding black troops, they will be summarily executed. Any black troops captured will promptly be sent back into slavery if not executed. He did say that privates and non-commissioned officers, they're just instruments, and so they would be treated nicely. So those guys didn't have to worry about that. But Mr. Lincoln is like, okay, well, if you actually catch the perpetrators of these crimes, it's one thing. But to just randomly take Confederate POWs to execute them, in the like manner that the Confederates would be executing, Union soldiers, that would be a problem. He says, because, it was just wrong and it would spiral out of control. And Mr. Lincoln said, that he felt that over time the Confederates would eventually stop such barbarous warfare, and over time, less evil would occur. Now, Mr. Douglas did not necessarily agree with that, but he did understand the president. And on the last point of commendations and promotions, Mr. Lincoln told him, although he didn't commit to it, he says, look, any commission that comes from the War Department to commission colored troops, I will sign. I remember when I was in graduate school, and I was in the Library of Congress one morning, and I remember that day, I think it was my African American history class, and I remember because everything that I had learned, it seemed, had come together and formulated one question. I remember putting my head down in my hand, and it formulated one question, and here's the question I asked. What do black folks have to do in this country to prove that they are human beings, number one, and number two, that they were willing to defend the country that they loved? Every person of color who is, or will serve in the U.S. military stands on the shoulders of African American troops and sailors who fought in the American Civil War. And we can thank Mr. Douglas for that.